Hello, my name is Alex Isles and welcome. In today's episode we're going to be talking about Oswiu, overlord of Britain. Welcome back, it's great to have you with us. In today's episode we're going to be talking about the overlord of Britain, the man who picked up the pieces after his brother Oswald had been violently martyred by Penda, king of Mercia, and then re-established Northumbria as the overlord kingdom over so much of northern Britain and also central and southern England as well. And we're going to talk about Oswiu today. If you like the sound of that, why don't you subscribe, because I think you're going to enjoy the content that we have on this channel, and you could always go back and watch some of the videos now. But now that you're subscribed, why not then you just jump right in and have a talk about Oswiu. So, Oswiu himself. Oswiu was just 4 years old when he became a refugee. Just like his brother Oswald, they had to flee for their lives. Their uncle Edwin was coming back up. Edwin had just killed Aelfrith, their father, and now they were refugees and they fled up to the kingdom of Dalmatia just up here. So when they fled up to Dalmatia, he was in exile right up until he was 21 when he returned, likely with his brother, and probably became a sub-king for him within his kingdom. Now Oswiu was a really interesting guy because unlike many other Northumbrian kings, he's the only Northumbrian king who actually manages to die in his bed. Now that is a massive achievement for the early Middle Ages. They either get murdered, forcibly retired, or exiled, or even worse, killed in battle. So to be honest, dying in your bed is a massive achievement. And alongside this as well, when he was king of Northumbria, he ruled for 28 years, which in itself is a huge achievement. Now, he was the third son of Aelfrith, and when he was the third son of Aelfrith, he was also the second son of Acca, his mother, and he probably never expected to be king. He probably thought his eldest brother would become king of Northumbria, and so he was ready to become a warlord, and he learnt about the skills of becoming a warlord in early medieval Britain and Ireland. And he actually grew up amongst the Dalmatians, just over here in Northern Ireland and in Western Scotland, and so it was actually the king of Dalmatia, Yonich Bute, who actually gave him his arms and made him into a warrior, which we know from Irish sources as well. And so because of that, he would have raided the Picts, the Strathclyde Britons, the other Irish tribes, and possibly the Welsh as well, as a young warrior, as he would go around doing these important raids to build his prestige, build his own warband, and become his own warrior in his own right, possibly looking for a powerful political marriage to set him up. It was actually during his time in Ireland that he actually met Finn, and Finn was a member of the O'Neill family. Now when she was a member of the O'Neill family, she was the daughter or the granddaughter of the High King of Ireland, and in her veins ran the blood of an Irish hero, Neil of the Nine Hostages. Now this semi-mythological figure is the person who set up Ulster and the area around here with his own warband in the post-Roman period. We don't know how real he is, or if he isn't real, he could have been possibly a guy who was fought on behalf of the Romans and then came and established himself back in Northern Ireland, but he's a very impressive warlord in his own right. And he created his own dynasty, the O'Neills, who would rule Northern Ireland in many ways right through into the sort of late 8th, early 9th centuries in various ways before they started to lose power. So when we have this powerful dynasty, Oswiu has this relationship with Finn, and when they have this relationship, it actually results in a son, Aelfrith. And I won't talk too much about him because he actually eventually becomes a king of Northumbria in his own right. But we see again, Oswiu is maybe positioning himself that he's going to live in Ireland his entire life. Maybe that was his plan, that was his thoughts. He thought, maybe I'm never going to go back to Northumbria because of the fact Edwin's king over there. But when Edwin dies, suddenly he's in a position to return with his brother Oswald, and he probably becomes a sub-king within the Northumbrian kingdom. Now we fast forwards to 642. 642, Oswald is martyred, so Oswiu rides down incredibly bravely and actually recovers his brother's body parts. When he recovers them, he brings them up to Bamborough, and Oswald's arm is kept as a relic, said to have not be corrupted, and then Oswald's other body parts are actually used later on to establish monasteries and other religious sites throughout the northeast and in other parts of the British Isles. So St. Oswald is then established, but Oswiu himself doesn't actually put too much emphasis on his brother's cult. The reason why is obviously you don't want to be overshadowed by the previous king and your own brother when you're now ruling the area. When he's doing this, he initially has some difficulty, so he starts looking for political marriages, and he marries Eanfled, his wife. When he marries Eanfled, she is the daughter of Edwin, so his maternal uncle, the very king who he fled away from. So when Oswald comes back after Edwin's defeat and his death, her family had already fled down to her maternal family's home of Kent. So he then requests for her to come back up, and he sends one of his priests down, who is called Utter, and Utter then brings her back up to the northeast. She marries him, and this is a very interesting setup, which would then cause a bit of tension later on, because she's a Catholic and he's a Celtic Christian. He follows the church up here at Iona, where he grew up. She follows Rome. So we'll come to that in a little bit. But when this is going on, they marry, and initially he has a couple of sub-kings down here in Deria. First of all is Oswin. Oswin is a part of Edwin's dynasty, and he's another one of the Derian dynasty down here that would have ruled in the area. When he takes over in 642, and he rules Deria as its own independent kingdom right up to 651. From the sources, we can see he's an incredibly pious and caring king. He cares about his people, and Aidan of Lindisfarne really loved him. When he really loved him, we know that Oswin gave gifts to Aidan, and they had a relationship, and I've mentioned this as well in my video about Aidan, which you can watch on the channel. But alongside this as well, they were also good friends. And so actually what happens is that eventually in 651, Oswiu feels strong enough to go and take back Deria from Oswin. Oswin raises his army and then chooses to disband it because he doesn't want his people to die in battle. And he goes to one of his lord's houses and he stays in there, one of his fanes, and he stays inside his hall, and his fane betrays him because what happens is Oswiu's troops turn up and kill him. And so when he dies, within a fortnight, Aidan of Lindisfarne dies at Bamborough, just nearby. And when he dies at Bamborough, it's said that he dies of a broken heart, leaning against the church that he established at Bamborough. Now, one of the guys who writes about Aidan, John Connell, who wrote a book called The Man Who Gave His Horse to a Beggar, actually thinks that possibly this was very politically expedient for Oswiu because Aidan was so connected to Oswald, and alongside this as well, Aidan had chastised him for killing Oswin. So there is suggestion that the possibility that Aidan may have been poisoned or murdered. I don't put too much weight to that. I think that's maybe putting a bit too much into it. I think the 58-year-old Irish priest who had walked everywhere and done a whole life of serving the British people as a whole probably just wore himself out, and without modern medicine, the fact that he lived a monastic lifestyle, would travel the roads of early medieval Britain in all weathers, probably was more than enough to see that 58 was a really good innings and was a really good life for someone of that age. And in fact, it's the same age that Oswiu himself lives to. So you can see right there, it's not an unusual amount of time in some ways for someone to live at that time if they are living within the sort of high status society of Northumbria. So when Oswin dies, Oswiu takes Oswald's son. Yes, you try and say that fast a few times, but he takes Oswald's son, who is called Uthelwald. Now Uthelwald, he then puts him as the sub-king in Deria, and he's probably a puppet king or a sub-king of Deria, and he works quite well initially with his uncle from 651 till 655. But then he tries to backstab his uncle, we think, or possibly this was a deal between the two, we don't know. But what happens is that Uthelwald makes a deal with Penda, the guy who killed Oswald, and he says, right, I'll support you while you ravage Northumbria, and you can come up and we'll raid Northumbria together. So Penda then comes up through Deria into Bernicia, and they're ready to fight against Oswiu. But when the battle lines are drawn, Uthelwald pulls away. He doesn't support Penda, and Penda gets surrounded and killed in battle. And so it possibly was Oswiu being very political, getting revenge for his brother's killer, and Uthelwald getting revenge on his father's killer as well. After that point, Uthelwald takes up the life of a hermit and goes and lives in Kirkendale in Yorkshire. And so because of that, he then removes himself from the political dealings, and we know he was a very pious man. He actually granted land to St. Chad, another really important apostle within the Northumbrians, who then helped establish churches around the region. So again, we're seeing the politics going on here. Maybe if Uthelwald had already approached his uncle and said, look, I'm not really cut out for this kingship thing, I would much prefer to retire as a monk break, and then Oswiu just decides, right, okay, this is the chance. I can then do a play here to get rid of one of my biggest opponents. This then places Oswiu in control of parts of northern Mercia, and he's able to put sub-kings over there for a number of years over northern Mercia and take control of that area a little bit as well. So we're seeing more power plays in and around the British kingdoms. Oswiu's control over Mercia doesn't stay for too long, but he's still able to establish control over the northern elements of it and put sub-kings over northern Mercia for a while. Following on from this, he then takes his son Acfrith, and Acfrith becomes the sub-king of Deria. Acfrith then rules Deria from 655 to 664. Now, Acfrith seems to have been starting to flex his muscles. Maybe he was plotting against his own father. Maybe he wanted to be king of all united Northumbria, and he was just sitting there. You know, one of the most dangerous things for medieval kings was to have a son who basically was of an age where he could be king himself, but the king was living a long, natural, happy life. And then your son starts getting itchy feet. Henry II, for instance, King of England, he was blessed with 4 sons, all of them very politically able and all with sort of desires to inherit. And his sons revolted against him numerous times, which eventually resulted in Henry becoming quite a cynical and heartbroken character in his older years. So again, in the same way, Oswiu is suffering from the same problem. And so Acfrith is starting to stretch his muscles, and he is now going to start looking at ways to become more powerful and more influential within Northumbria. And he takes land that belonged to Celtic Christians and he gives it to Wilfrid. Now Wilfrid was a Catholic priest, and he was starting to stretch his own muscles, very politically influential guy. Later on, Wilfrid would actually build Hexham Abbey, which was seen as the largest stone church north of the Alps in Europe. And it's thought that he used money from the Picts that was basically used from harsh taxation under the reign of Oswiu and also Ecgfrith, Oswiu's successor, to fund this massive church. But Wilfrid was still a young man at this point, and he was very politically able and also very driven. And so he was now looking for a way to advance his own ideas and his own political position within Northumbria. This came to a head in 664 with the Synod of Whitby. Now, I mentioned before that the Queen was a Catholic. Now, Oswiu, just like his brother Oswald, was a Celtic Christian, and they followed Iona. Now, Iona had different traditions to Rome. They celebrated Easter on a different date, and the Celtic monks had a different haircut to the Roman monks. And when they had a different haircut, this may seem ridiculous to you today, but this was a theological difference because the Celtic Church could trace its way back to the Roman early Christians in Britain, and so they had different traditions that originally would come from the early Christians within the Middle East. And so they hadn't had the development of Roman Catholicism, and so their Christianity just had a different flavour, but they believed in basically all the same things as the Roman Catholic Church. So with this going on, this was causing tension. And when it was causing tension, it was now down to Oswiu to sit down with the Celtic Church and the Roman Catholic Church and decide which of the two churches would be the dominant practices within Northumbria. Now within the Synod of Whitby, we had Wilfrid leading the Catholic faction, and he was the one who had put forward the arguments, and he also had backup from Egbert. And Egbert was Frankish from France, but he couldn't speak Old English. So because of that, Wilfrid was the main translator and leader of the Catholic forces at the Synod of Whitby. Now, following on from that as well, on the Celtic side, you had Hild. Now, Hild was also another member of the Derian royal house. Her great uncle was Edwin, and so because of that she is a princess, but she became a nun and then ruled the joint monastery at Whitby. So when she ruled the joint monastery at Whitby, this was an important thing. We had a princess from the Derian royal line who was involved in the church, who is then, as a part of this, mediating between various factions for the future of Christianity in the northeast. So we see the power of women within Northumbria and in the church during this early medieval period, and I find it really fascinating as well to see that. And I'll probably do a video about Hild and a few of the other Northumbrian women as well at a later point. And then alongside this, another Celtic leader is Colman, who is also the Bishop of Lindisfarne and Northumbria. So when you've got these guys going on, they start debating. And so the Celtic Church puts forward their arguments, and then the Roman Church puts forward theirs. And so we have the Venerable Bede, who writes all down for us and tells us what happened. And when he tells us what happened, we know that Wilfrid led the charge for the Catholic faction. He argues that Rome was the place where the apostles were persecuted, that the Catholic traditions were basically practiced across the whole of the Christian world, from Egypt right the way through to Northumbria itself. And so who are you to fight against such a global church? Following on from that, he then put forward the argument that Columba, the founder of Iona, was ignorant of Catholic practices because he was outside, but the modern Ionian church was not ignorant. They knew about the Catholic practices, but were continuing to practice their old ways outside of it. He also said that St. Peter himself and the traditions of the early church were then added to later on by future popes, especially from the Council of Nicaea that set up the Christian faith as it was understood in the Roman period and then later on into the Middle Ages. So because of the Council of Nicaea, this trumped the early practices and set out how the church should be ruled. And so there was no excuse anymore for the Ionian church to practice its own ways. And finally, that Peter was the first pope. And so because of that, all the other popes drew legitimacy from Peter. So who were the Celtic Christians to actually argue against the primacy or the importance of Peter and the Pope? Also from biblical verses, Peter was said to be the rock which the church would be built upon. So because of that, why should Iona stand against Peter and the popes themselves? All of these arguments eventually convinced Oswiu that the Roman Church was the correct church, and it actually led for many of the Celtic believers to actually be persecuted. And when they were being persecuted, this caused for a lot of them to actually leave, and many of the Celtic monks at Lindisfarne actually went across to Iona, taking with them relics as they left. And other ones would go to the south of Ireland and establish monasteries down there. But the other ones who converted to the Catholic faith and converted to the Catholic way of doing things stayed within Northumbria, and Northumbria became a Catholic English kingdom. Now this is really interesting because it had a lot of domino effects for the Northumbrian kingdom for years to come. And as I mentioned before, Acfrith was actually stretching his muscles against his father, and Bede writes that he takes up arms against him. And so surprisingly, in 644, Acfrith disappears from the record. And when he disappears from the record, we see Egfrith becoming the sub-king down in Deria. Now he's sub-king down there for 6 years until his father passes away, and then Egfrith becomes the next king of Northumbria. And Egfrith, just like Oswiu, struggles with Wilfrid for the rest of his reign. So there's an interesting one for you right there. Now what I love about Oswiu is even though we have saintly King Oswald, who I'm a big fan of by the way, I do like Oswald, but Oswiu is so much more interesting for me in so many ways, because Oswald is always clean within the historical record. When Bede writes about him, he is this Christian king who fights against pagan Penda and all of those sort of things. And so we only get glimpses actually within Oswald's narrative of his more questionable sides, where, you know, he would have fought and raided other people. He was a warlord, he fought in battle, he was very shrewd, he actually took this area here of Edinburgh from the Britons, he was aggressive, and even his death seems to be him pushing into northern Mercia to set up a puppet king against Penda himself. And so Oswald is cleansed and sanitized by his saintly nature. But Oswiu, we see warts and all. He, murders his enemies. He fights against his own children. His children revolt against him. And this powerful king establishes himself to the point where he can actually die in his own bed within this early medieval period. And he's such a questionable character in so many ways, fighting and murdering against Oswin and all of those other things. But it's because of that I see a much more realistic character that I go, wow, studying and learning about him is so fascinating. And whereas if I was ruled by him, I may not like him because of what he's done, but he seems to bring stability and peace to Northumbria and a growth of the kingdom. So a very, very interesting character, and this overlord who's able to establish himself with power over the Picts in some ways, over the kingdom of Dalatia, over other kingdoms in the British Isles, and eventually establishes Northumbria as this incredibly powerful kingdom in northern Britain. So I really hope you've enjoyed the video today. If you haven't already, why not subscribe now? And if you would like to support me further, I also have a Patreon, which you can find in the description below. I also do guided tours of the northeast of England, so if you would like to do that, why don't you look at my website www.ilestours.co.uk. In the meantime, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me for another video in the near future. Until then though, thank you very much.